Talent fuels the spirit of competition among the human race, but true competition cannot exist in the absence of diversity. Representation is how one learns, and there is a large lack of representation within equestrian sports around the world, invalidating the nature of its competition. Wealth and status have always been the guiding characteristics of power and control, but there is no diversity within the groups of people that have the wealth and status. This pattern has spread throughout evolution, even into sports. Equestrian sports are supposed to be judged on fair grounds with no barrier to who can compete. If this is the case, then why is there no diversity within the competitors? Why is this important? Because equestrian sports are very popular all over the world, and there is no diversity within them, even though it is one of the few sports where men and women compete on equal terms. It is relevant in demonstrating the complexity of power and status in society today, and hopefully begging the same questions within other sports across the globe. Questions being, what are the adverse effects of particularisms in the competitiveness of the equestrian show world, and how do these particularisms relate to the degradation of the essential workers in the sport? To answer these questions, it is important to first understand what a particularism is in reference to a sociological perspective. A particularism is an exclusive attachment to the interests of one group or class of people. In an article titled Horsepower, Gender Work and Wealth in Canadian Show Jumping, the author discusses the hierarchical dynamics of competitors in the upper-level shows and how they are dominated by men. The author then goes on to explain that in lower to mid-levels, it is predominantly women. She explained that this gender gap is due to not only excellence in riders, but money as a necessity as well.
I would say the diversity in equestrian sports is pretty limited. Equestrian sports are generally expensive, and I would say a luxury. And I think with good reason, right? If we think about activities that are, critical to our well-being and like critical to everyday life, equestrian sports probably isn't one of those. So
minimally, I would say 90% of my clients, but I would say I have probably taught 95% white, upper middle class young ladies and women, and maybe 5% that would not fall into the Caucasian descriptor.
In an article by Howell, we learn that throughout history, mounted riders in positions of power have all been white, whether it be military or mounted police. The article even looks at the idea that in times of slavery, black men were looked down upon by the white man who was on horseback. The height difference between a man on horseback and a man on the ground is demonstrative of the inequality between the white man and the black man. Amos Mafokate, the first competitive black equestrian in South Africa and the first black show jumper in Europe, recounts his experience and views on the past and current situation that the equestrian sport is in. He talks about how there were only white people doing the sport and how there is still mainly a white focus. Mafokate explains that the reason for the lack of black people in equestrian sports comes down to money and culture. To combat the issue of money, Mafokate started a riding center that is free to his students so they can learn the values that go along with horseback riding, because as he knows it, the sport is about so much more than competition.
Typically, minorities have lower levels of income, and with lower levels of income, entering into luxury things and into like non-essential activities becomes prohibited. So I think naturally people with expendable extra income are going to be the people that you see in equestrian sports and with horses, because it's not just the cost of buying the horse, it's feeding the horse and the vet bills and farrier bills.
The lack of diversity in the sport is supporting the idea that talent no longer matters. Why should talent matter if you check the acceptable societal boxes? Research done in an article by Kay Dashper focuses on the declining value of the horse for the rider. It discusses that the true nature of riding has always been about the relationship of trust between the horse and rider, which takes time to develop, and how more modernly those relationships are not able to form because of the quick turnaround of horses in the competitive setting. When people are unable to figure out a horse within a few months, they sell them to buy new ones so they'll be able to ride faster.
You have access to the higher caliber of horses and the better trainers, the better tack, and more opportunities with clinics and places you can go. You can have all the money in the world and not be able to ride. And then you can be super talented but not be able to afford the horse shows or the lessons.
Not only has the lack of diversity in equestrian competition affected the nature of the competition, but it has also affected the care and treatment of the grooms and barn workers in the sport who are often immigrants or undocumented. Article by Castañeda, it talks about the many health issues that racetrack employees face over their careers working. It also discusses the high prevalence of undocumented or semi-legal workers and how their living conditions are less than ideal due to the cheap wages they are paid and the high intensive labor they are expected to perform. Because of their little coverage and cheap wages, many of the injuries experienced by these workers go untreated and become much bigger problems down the road. It mentions that increasing rates of substance abuse in the racetrack workers and the lack of treatment for these issues is very prevalent.
No, they're not. Because they are the first ones there every day and the last ones to leave. They work sun up to sundown, nonstop, all day, where the trainers and riders come and go as they please and can just toss the horse to the groom and go.
I think it's varied, and there really isn't a standard across the board. And, you know, it's really hard to implement a standard. For example, you know, I said earlier I was a USHJA certified trainer. However, you can find really poor trainers that are USHJA certified, and you can find really good ones that have never been certified. So, in this country anyway, we really don't seem to have a very good method to standardize training and grooming services and the expectations thereof.
How do we combat these issues? The lack of diversity and the unjust treatment of the essential staff in the sport is so prevalent. In a broad sense, major socioeconomic change must occur. More opportunities need to be created for minority communities. Directly within the equestrian sport, opportunities need to be created for all competitors that lack the financial funds and circumstances to join the sport. Consider Enos Mafokate. He created a barn where people could go to ride and not have to worry about the funds. They could simply help out around the farm and get to experience the joys of riding. Change starts at a young age. It is important to target the youth in order to change ideals that have been set in place for centuries.